It's been 40 years since the storms rolled in and the dam broke, the floodwaters destroying just about everything in its path.
I would say this is one of the worst disasters I've seen in my nursing career.
There was extreme tragedy.
27 years of work gone in 6 hours.
Total loss. I don't know where we'll start now. I got all my kids out. I'm thankful for that.
And heartbreak.
To this day yet, I have terrible feelings about the people that we lost.
Helpers and rebuilding.
I've managed to accumulate some of the best people I've ever run into.
A community that pushed through, resilient as ever.
Very proud of the citizens of Johnstown, and absolutely we'll be back.
Then and now.
Everybody that pitched in at the time are still around and still pitching in.
6 News remembers the Johnstown Flood of 1977, 40 years later. Good evening and welcome. You know, you really can't talk about July 20th, 1977 without first talking about July 19th, 1977. It was a Tuesday. It was a particularly unremarkable day that was followed by many starkly remarkable days. July 19th, typical summer day. It was much like it is right now. It was hot. It was humid. A group of guys from WJAC TV and a group of guys from the Johnstown Tribune-Democrat were playing our sort of usual softball game that morning. And I remember while I was breathing in the dust at Eng Field playing that game that, boy, I hope it rains soon because it was so hot, so oppressive. You know, anything to break that heat. And there were thunderstorms in the forecast, like there often are on July days in Johnstown. But there was no warning, no hint of what was to come. Tonight, we are standing in Johnstown Central Park, right in front of a memorial that was built. It has the names of the 85 people who lost their lives 40 years ago. Obviously, this park has been a mainstay of this community for decades. And today, as you look around, the grass is green. There are plenty of flowers. Birds are chirping. There's always people walking in and around Central Park. But I want you to take a look. I want you to take a look at what it looked like 40 years ago today. It was simply a muddy mess. There was debris washed amongst the trees and the benches. Hundreds of people in the middle of this downtown central business district, unsure where to turn, what to do next. And we have so much more video of what happened in the Johnstown area 40 years ago that we're going to get to. But first, we want to take a bit of a look back. Now, 40 years ago, I was a young man with a family, unsure where my career was headed. 40 years ago today, the flood changed my life. At that time, I was a staff announcer at Channel 6, did not work for the news department, somehow made my way in the morning of July 20th and went to my boss and said, look, there's a story out there, they need help. We were knocked off the air because there was no power at our transmitter, and I want to go out and help tell that story. So he said, go ahead. So my first reporting job at Channel 6 was the Johnstown Flood. No one could have prepared anyone for what we were going to see. And for many people, you know, the flood, what happened in the days after, defines a career. For other people like me, the flood began my career. And I've always said I was blessed by the tragedy. And Dylan Richards has the story of a district judge who at the time of the flood was working for the Cambria County Coroner's Office.
John Barron was in his early 20s. About a week before the flood, the Cambria coroner asked Barron to come work for him.
I was like, okay, we'll try it.
He had no idea what would happen next. After the worst of the flood was over, the cleanup began, but also the daunting task of identifying the bodies, but first, finding them.
We found them any and everywhere.
In the streets, in homes, businesses, rivers, bodies everywhere for weeks. So many that the coroner had Barron set up a morgue in the old Richland High School building. Outside, tents with coffins. Inside, grieving families trying to find their loved ones.
We spent a lot of hours, day and night. We never left up there. We slept up there, we ate up there. I mean, we never left.
Much of that time spent talking to families, asking them questions like, did their loved ones have an identifying feature, a scar or a birthmark?
Because it really was a process, and it's something you couldn't take shortcuts in. We had to be sure.
Their goal, not one person, not one, who would be buried without a name.
We wanted every person to be accounted for that was recovered. And it's not fair if, you know, it's your family and that happens to be a relative, you want them back.
Body after body, some unrecognizable, some friends.
I was by myself at like 3 in the morning and I was cleaning the mud and debris off this particular person. And I realized that I'd been at this person's house 2 days earlier for dinner. And now I was cleaning up a good friend of mine. The person was one of the victims.
Barron says he was never the same after the flood. For him, someone who never expected or asked for the job he got, a lesson. You do what you have to do to help your neighbors. That's what he said everybody did.
And Johnstown wasn't waiting for anybody. Johnstown got up and took care of their own problems in recovery of the flood.
In Johnstown, Dylan Richards, 6 News.
And again, covering the flood of 1977 was my first experience as a reporter for 6 News. Photographer Dave Delosier and I headed out, and our first stop was the Memorial Medical Center, then called Conemaugh Memorial Hospital, where we talked to County Coroner Joe Govecker to see if there had been any fatalities. There were a handful then, but Govecker was sure the death toll would rise. We made our way downtown. There were no words then, and there are no words now to fully describe the destruction.
The devastation is just unbelievable. Most of the people you talk to that are walking around the downtown say they've never seen anything like it.
It was everywhere, and it was severe. Cars tossed around like toys, water, mud. I'll never forget the mud. And debris was scattered everywhere you looked. People were milling around, stunned like we were by what we were looking at. There were police and state troopers on every street. Downtown was a disaster area, a war zone. Nothing was spared. The enormity of what had happened became clear minute by minute. Still, we had no idea how enormous it was. We would drive where we could, but we spent most of that day walking. Communications were non-existent. Phone lines were down. No one had power, so we did what we could. We shot film to show the damage. We talked to people still dazed and confused at what had happened. We went back downtown where we talked to John Gunter, the then chief of the Penn Traffic Company. He was wearing a revolver on his hip to protect merchandise in the store, merchandise that wasn't worth much anymore. I ran into Bill Glosser outside Glosser Brothers, and while we talked about the damage, he invited me in for a chocolate milkshake because the ice cream was melting in the staggering heat. In those chaotic first hours of Wednesday, July the 20th, it felt like we were trying to put a puzzle together. There were thousands of pieces, and it was difficult to tell where they belonged. Long-established landmarks were either gone or changed so dramatically they were unrecognizable. But none of us were prepared for what was to come. Slowly, we began to hear about the horror that was Tanneryville. There are countless stories, and anyone who lived in this town in 1977 and lived through the flood has a different story to tell. And Tony Martin is standing outside what used to be Lee Hospital, which was one of 3 hospitals at that time where hundreds of victims were sent for treatment. Tony?
Marty, that's right, and not surprisingly, for countless days, first responders from, of course, here at Lee Hospital were on the front lines, again, for days and days. One of those ER doctors here from Lee Hospital was Sally Dick, and again, she was an ER doctor, and she was on the front line. She was sent over to Tanneryville. She was actually airlifted over to Tanneryville, seeing a ton of trauma, of course, in her day, and nothing would compare to what she would see in Tanneryville in 1977. She was met by stranded survivors. Their resilience, their kindness, and their compassion is her most vivid memory of the '77 flood.
You wanted to do something, you know, and I couldn't go to work because the hospital wasn't functioning. So that's where they took me, and we got to Tanneryville, and of course I got to see from the air how much damage there was everywhere through Hornerstown and Moxham, and it was just unbelievable. And then when you get to Tanneryville and you realize these people were stranded and nobody even knew they were stranded, you know, because there was no communication. From the air you could just see how the water had cascaded down the main street in Tanneryville, and there would be a house standing and the house across the street was just gone. Everybody was impacted. They either had friends, family, or a neighbor who was gone or missing. Nobody was worried about themselves. They were just really worried about taking care of each other. I was so impressed.
Dr. Sally Dick ended up spending 10 days in Tanneryville. The first people who she attended to was an 11-year-old boy separated from his parents. He was safe and uninjured, but that boy eventually became part of her family. He is now her son-in-law. There were hundreds of everyday heroes rushing in to help at a time of great need. Lauren Petrelli met up with two men who did their best to help people at the time, and just one of those happens to be my father-in-law.
The lightning was terrible that night, the thunder and lightning. It was just constant.
Don Tajeski still remembers how unusual the night sky looked the night the flood hit. He had just returned home from his shift as a maintenance worker at Lee Hospital when his boss called him back in.
I stopped at the incline and looked down, and I could see water glistening in all of the parking lots downtown.
That's when Tajeski used his boat to reach the hospital, something he still has today.
One of the big needs the hospital had was to get new personnel in. We were in the process of getting two nurses off of the veranda when we sunk the boat.
Tajeski's story is just one of many from that day. Mike Butler was 22 and a fire captain for Southmont Fire Department when the flood hit.
We were all on the same frequency, so flooding in Seward, we were hearing that back on the ones in Cambria County, and it was hard to try and determine, what street was where.
Butler recalls how difficult it was to put out a structure fire in downtown Johnstown.
They didn't even hit fire hydrants. They just dropped the hard tubes in, and they just started sucking the flood water off of the street and putting it onto the fire.
Both of these men agree, even if another disaster did hit Flood City, their community will always prevail.
I think the people in this town, if it ever happens again, they'll pick up the pieces and put it back together.
All right, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to take you through some of the destruction that hit nearby Somerset County. Welcome back. By far, Johnstown had the most severe damage from the '77 flood, but also into northern Somerset County. In fact, my hometown of Winber, there was many areas underwater. In fact, 2 people died. Most of the footage that we have never seen before was taken by a gentleman that lives in Winber. Now, a lot of the footage we have seen is from downtown Johnstown, shot by photographers here at Channel 6, but this video is from Winber. Most of it, again, never before seen. It's footage from the day after the flood. One local media company is showing it for the first time.
Hundreds of people took their seats in the Arcadia Theater, waiting for a glimpse at never-before-seen footage of the 1977 flood damage.
The images that you're about to see are a compilation of the footage that was captured by 7 community members.
7 films edited into an hour-long movie by Media Exchange, a company in Winber that started this project about a month and a half ago.
A few of them are from Winber. One of them is from South Fork. One of them shows downtown Johnstown.
That footage, those photos, a stark reminder of the destruction that happened 40 years ago.
It's still hard to believe that water can do that much damage. So it's just very interesting to see the pictures and remember how much damage was done.
Nancy Hagee was living in Winber during the flood. Her mother-in-law's house on 18th Street, destroyed.
And it was a very traumatic experience seeing the water come up over the creek wall.
The flood of memories rushed back for Pat Reitzman.
It came at you. You didn't know what was happening until you saw the floodwaters coming and realized, wow, we got to get out of here.
She saw the film with her husband, a Scout firefighter at the time.
I was only in a little piece of Winber and saw the disaster. I mean, I really didn't see it all like we saw here, and I go, oh, it's just unbelievable, and so many lives lost.
So many lives lost. Businesses, homes, damaged or destroyed.
There's a range of emotions with this event, and just having everyone gathered here, it's just really special. So we're very happy that the community has responded the way they have.
In Winber, Daniel Hamburg, 6 News.
Now, Media Exchange is selling DVDs just to cover the cost of conversion and also materials. Now, the theater is a piece of flood memorabilia itself. Built in 1921, the Arcadia Theater was designed for the coal miners, the workers of the area. It went through a few changes over the first several decades, going from vaudeville to silent movies and then to black and white films. But then came the flood, and the damage was just devastating. The Eureka Coal Heritage Foundation purchased the Arcadia in 1989, and restoration began in 1990. But until donations and sponsorships were secured, the theater didn't reopen until 1998. And we want to send it back over to Marty, who's over in Central Park, to talk about another local event impacted by the flood. That event continues today. Mart?
Yeah, Tony, we're talking about the Ferndale Jubilee, which this year is in its 87th year. 40 years ago, though, things took a dramatic change when those floodwaters moved into Ferndale.
The National Guard, they were landing helicopters on our football field there, and it was all kind of, activity. And they came up to the tent, get something to eat, and they were in and out of there. And so we had that tent open, and people ate down there. It was kind of a focal point, really.
As current Cambria County Commissioner Mark Wissinger has said he was just an average Joe in his 20s when the flood hit. Wiss, who just happened to be volunteering at the Ferndale Jubilee at the time, told us the event was forced to close, but the famous kitchen at the Jubilee stayed open for weeks. Volunteers working around the clock to take care of as many people as possible, providing food for those who were helping with the flood effort and making a profit from feeding the community, which in turn helped them replenish supplies.
Well, you see that in these communities. You see it. I mean, the Ferndale Fire Company is typical of many of the other volunteer organizations. When you need a hand, yeah, they'll come forth and make it happen.
And Wiss says something, and by the way, Mark and I have been friends for 40 years, and he said something that I agreed with, something you'll hear a little bit more about later on, that the 77 flood certainly changed this community. Set it back for a while, but eventually it made the community come back even stronger. And we'll be back after a short break with the story of business owners and rebuilding. We continue our 6 News special remembering the Johnstown flood of 1977, 40 years later. This video is from downtown Johnstown, the cleanup in the days and weeks following the flood. Many businesses were destroyed, and one of those businesses has been a fixture in this community for more than 120 years, Miller's Clothing Store.
This was the calendar that was hanging on the day that it flooded.
Taylor Clark's heard many stories about that day, how it tested the resilience of his family's clothing store, a day that his father, Randy Clark, remembers all too well. He was 19.
I remember coming into the store, and the total downstairs was submerged, pretty much, and we had about 3 or 4 inches here on the main floor, just enough to ruin everything.
A total loss with no help in sight. Randy and 4 others took it upon themselves to get rid of the water, bucket by bucket.
And take it hand by hand, load by load, and it took us about 10 days to 2 weeks to do that.
The Clarks rebuilt and reopened, and today the recently remodeled store has a modern look. But below are still reminders of the flood.
That when I went down there, I wanted to sort of document how high this thing was. And so I wrote that with a red magic marker.
And that calendar, still in the exact same spot.
Yeah, that was my dad. They were going to take that down. He said, no, let's just leave that there.
Miller's Clothing Store was just one of many businesses affected by the flood. It now serves as a testament to the character of the people of Johnstown.
And I believe that, some better days are in front of us. Stay positive, be passionate, reinvest, and look forward to the future here in town.
Today is very similar to 40 years ago today, weather-wise. Franklin Street United Methodist Church thermometer said it's 92. Tony's back over in Central Park with a quick look to see if there's any rain on the way.
Marty, thanks. And it's hard to talk about the flood without really getting a perspective on how high that water really was. I'm 6'1". Behind me here at City Hall, there's a high water mark from July 20th of 1977, 8 feet 6 inches right here off of Main Street in downtown Johnstown. So just unbelievable how high that water was 40 years ago. We are tracking a couple of thunderstorms across parts of the region this afternoon. They're now slipping south of Interstate 80. They are moving southeastward. We're to be talking about thunderstorms here on the 40th anniversary of the flood, but they're heading southeast toward Johnstown. The good news is they are progressive and they're going to move out. So we're going to move from northwest to southeast. This line is actually going to bring in a very slight cool down and a slight drop in humidity for Friday. So tomorrow is looking pretty good. Sunshine, temperatures in the 80s over the weekend. However, on our 7-day, a couple of showers and a couple of storms around. Not going to be an all-day washout, but certainly a better chance of rain than what we've had the last couple of days. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back from here in downtown Johnstown.
Welcome back to our special look back at 40 years ago, and much of the greater Johnstown area lost power in July of 1977 following the flood. In fact, WJAC TV was not able to broadcast until Thursday evening because we lost power at the transmitter site. But we did have power in our building, and it was there that then Governor Milton Schaap, then Senator John Hines, and Congressman Jack Murtha reviewed film that had been shot by our team of photographers. Governor Schaap calling on Washington for help. In fact, that film was hand-carried to the White House, where it was shown to President Jimmy Carter, and the federal disaster designation that would make hundreds of millions of dollars of federal aid available quickly follow.
The TV filming that WJAC did, in my opinion, was the key reason how the White House people were able to move fast.
Governor Schaap was so impressed by what he saw in that 6 News film and the newscast and service to the community that followed in the days and weeks to come that he issued a state proclamation that honored the brave actions of the crew members who literally put themselves in harm's way to document the disaster. And today it is really remarkable to look at the streets of Johnstown to see what it looks like now and then remember what it looked like 40 years ago.
Seem to have good spirits. They're helping as much as they can, trying to get everything back to shape again.
No story about the Johnstown flood of 1977 would be complete if you didn't talk about the incredible spirit of the people who survived. The elderly man who told me outside the pile of wood that was his home, "We're fine. We'll just do what we do. Pick up and go. Pick up and go." Or Congressman John Murtha, who spent 3 weeks here but flew back to Washington to cast a vote for a reduced interest rate to help the region rebuild. Or the hundreds of people who shoveled mud for weeks as part of the cleanup. Or area native Lou Foy, who as chairman of the company kept Bethlehem Steel here as long as he could when it would have been so easy to close. Or the countless signs everywhere, "We will rebuild together." And we did. A tragic time, 40 years ago, a week that felt as if time stood still. It was certainly my honor and my privilege to serve you on a story that literally started my career at 6 News. And we want to thank you for being with us tonight, for witnessing 40 years of history. And as we say goodbye, we want to remember the 85 people that lost their lives in that flood. Good night.